Welcome back to Anti-Social Studies. Last episode, we talked about the first permanent English colony in the Americas. Jamestown and the entire Virginia colony was pretty typical of what would become known as the Southern colonies. Across the southern half of the Atlantic coast, colonies were founded by companies or by the crown, but for expressly economic purposes. This is in direct comparison to the so-called New England colonies, which were founded for entirely different reasons. And to understand these differences, let's move up from Jamestown further north to the Massachusetts Bay. Be honest, what do you know about the Pilgrims? And don't say buckle hats. I said that last time. Who were these pesky Puritans on a pilgrimage to Plymouth? Before we can understand New England, we have to understand Old England. Remember that in the 1530s, about 70 years before Jamestown, King Henry VIII had broken with the Catholic Church so that, among other things, he could divorce his first wife. His daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, formalized the new Church of England, or Anglican Church, which was technically a Protestant church, but it actually kept a lot of the same practices as the Catholic Church that it had just broken away from. This angered some people in England who felt like the Anglican Church hadn't eliminated enough of the problematic practices of Catholicism, and they needed to purify itself. These people were called Puritans, and they were really annoying to the monarch and other English leadership. Now, Puritan is still a pretty broad term because there were varying opinions on what needed to happen for the church to become sufficiently pure. But this growing movement found a lot of support with pretty much anyone in England who was growing frustrated with the oppressive power of the monarch, who also now happened to be the head of the new Church of England. So much for separation of church and state. The growing middle class in the cities, merchants and educated professionals like lawyers, often became Puritans because it was inherently a more democratic version of English Christianity. And a lot of these people were chafing under all of the economic restraints that came with a royal mercantilist system. Now, some of these Puritans believed they should go further than just criticizing the church. They wanted to separate from it entirely, and they were called Separatists. See how this works? They began to create their own independent parish churches, and they would bring in lecturers, educated young men fresh out of college who had new ideas, not just about religion, but also about this whole absolute monarchy thing. So these groups became problematic for the English government, so they were kicked out. Well, not kicked out. They were treated so badly in England that they chose to go find a new place to live. Thank you very much. They were done with the Old England, so they sailed across the Atlantic and set out creating a New England. That'll show them. This is when the Mayflower comes in. Around 100 men and women, a large group of them, Separatists, landed on the shores of Cape Cod and anchored at Plymouth Rock. Fun fact, Plymouth was actually named by John Smith. Oh, hey again, Mel Gibson, right? When he was down in Jamestown, he led expeditions to explore the coast and got as far as Cape Cod, apparently naming stuff all along the way. So in 1620, 13 years after Jamestown, the first permanent settlement of Europeans was established in the northern part of the American colonies, aka New England. The Plymouth colony was actually not super successful. Eventually, they're going to be absorbed into a larger colony nearby, the Massachusetts Bay colony, but there are a few important things that we need to know about Plymouth. First, we need to know what New England Puritanism looked like. For one, it was really intolerant of other denominations of Christianity, let alone other religions entirely. The Puritans believed that they had it right and everyone else had it wrong. Like, they wouldn't let anyone dance. So basically, Colonial New England was the prequel to Footloose. I want to point this out because there's this idea amongst a lot of US Americans that our country was founded on the idea of religious freedom, but that's not quite right. Our country, and New England specifically, was founded on the ideal of freedom to practice Protestant Christianity. They were just as intolerant of other beliefs as in the Old World, and that's not a good thing, but it's an important part of our nation's history that we have to acknowledge. But the way Puritan churches were set up also lent itself to a more democratic system than in other belief systems. Each church was basically independent and just loosely connected with other churches in the colony. This fragmentation made it so that each congregation had a level of freedom to interpret the Bible as they saw fit, which meant that a ton of different denominations branched off, Quakers, Baptists, etc. And the early New Englanders got used to a level of independence that's going to be hard to give up. Foreshadowing. The other key factor in Plymouth history is the creation of the Mayflower Compact. The early months of the colony were rough. Most settlers slept on the ship because it was safer, and they were all basically slowly starving to death until they met Squanto. For more about him, check out my audio episode all on Thanksgiving. Although the Separatists were a minority group on the Mayflower, they were united and very loud, and so they dominated the group politics. Do I see the roots of America's infuriating democratic system? Out of fear that other non-separatist settlers, who were referred to as strangers, by the way, would not adhere to the group will, the Separatists arranged a contract setting up a majority-rule government that would make decisions in the new colony while still swearing allegiance to the king. I want you to notice something here. When the settlers, especially in New England, arrive on the shores of America, they are quite literally on their own. Now, I'm not counting Indigenous Americans only because the new settlers didn't, so from their perspective, they were totally alone. It was pretty easy to do what you want, set up a relatively democratic government, for example, and just say that you were loyal to the crown. As long as you kept trading with the mother country, again, mercantilism, and stayed nominally loyal, you were kind of fine. And this was how the settlers existed for the first 100 years or so. It's called benign neglect. England kind of left them alone as long as they didn't cause too much trouble. Again, this is foreshadowing for when England is going to stop being so neglectful, and Americans are not going to like it. But like I mentioned before, Plymouth remained a small, relatively unsuccessful colony. Maybe it's because they were all so uptight from keeping themselves from dancing. I don't know. Eventually, they would get absorbed into a larger colony that was established just a few years after the Mayflower landing, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. This group of settlers were also mostly Puritans fleeing persecution under King Charles, and they were led by John Winthrop. Winthrop, a lawyer and Puritan leader, sailed west in the spring of 1630, and on the journey he wrote out a sermon called A Model of Christian Charity. He envisioned the new Massachusetts colony as a special sort of experiment that had a covenant with God and with each other to show the world what a truly Christian community could look like. He famously called the colony a city upon a hill with the eyes of all people on them. A little self-important, but I mean, he wasn't totally wrong. By the end of the decade, over 14,000 Puritan settlers had come to Massachusetts, and Winthrop would ultimately be elected governor 12 times. Under his leadership, the colony took a moderate conservative approach to government. And let me clarify. For the time, it was moderate in that it was significantly more democratic than back in the old world, but from our view, it would be very conservative. He emphasized group discipline and individual responsibility to serve the community. He was very similar in this way to our guy John Smith down in Virginia. But he definitely wasn't progressive in any way. In Massachusetts, only white male members of a Puritan congregation could vote. And to be accepted into a Puritan congregation, it had to be approved by those who were already in. This is another important note. Most people, especially educated elites, whether it's the king or John Winthrop or eventually George Washington, are kind of terrified of true democracy. Winthrop called it, quote, the meanest and worst of all forms of government. Very few people in this time period believed that every single person should have an equal say. They thought that this would just be chaotic mob rule and nothing would ever get done. But again, just like in Plymouth, there are important slivers of democracy that are popping up in the colonies, especially in the northern colonies. They all established elected legislatures like Parliament back in England, and they prohibited ministers from holding public office, continuing to adhere to some separation of church and state. In reality, ministers had enormous influence in the government, but that wasn't always a bad thing since ministers were often some of the most educated men in the colony. For example, Harvard College was formed in 1636, just 6 years after Massachusetts was founded, specifically to train Puritan ministers. So Massachusetts was conservatively moving in the direction of democracy, or at least a form of democracy that gave white Christian men more say. But there were some who were going to take it even further. Next episode, we're going to look at a few outliers. Badass men and a woman, whoa, who took the American dream further than just economic opportunity or Puritan religious freedom. They saw the New World as a unique opportunity to create an entirely new society that could reject the hierarchy and divisions that had developed over millennia back in Europe. Can you tell they're my favorite? Thanks again for watching. Like and subscribe, and if you want to support me even more, go join patreon.com/antisocialstudies.